Welcome back to Missouri for another Facebook Live. We're back here today. We're going to take just a couple of minutes and let some people get logged in and hop on. While we have a minute here, we'll show you what's going on. Jan has a couple of very nice hand-pieced quilts going over here on the machine. These were made by Jane Young in Smithville, Texas, a friend of ours. And it's a set of two. So hand-piece quilts are a little bit differently, handled just a little bit differently than the, most of the machine-pieced quilts. They take a little bit more care. I try not to put too much tension on them when we're quilting them. Usually we use kind of float the top and keep it as loose as we possibly can. We use the gamma quilt clips on them while we're quilting them, and they're just kind of free spirits usually, so you just kind of try not to stretch them too much or make them too square, and you just roll with them. So it's a lot of fun. These are really pretty quilts. So what we were going to talk about today, I think, is we're going to talk about no surprises. Jan named this segment No Surprises. And what we wanted to talk about is some things to look at before we start our quilt. So when we get down the line of ways that we indeed have no surprises. We want our quilts to turn out as nice as they possibly can. We want the stitching as nice as it possibly can be. And, we don't want to be disappointed with a quilt job when we're done. We want our quilting always to look nice and be proud of it. So we're going to talk about some ways that, things to look at, and so good ways to get started. So we're going to start back over here with the machine, and one of the first things we do before we start for the day is we make sure that there's no oil. We make sure that there's no oil on the table. We just make a scan of it, wipe down the table. We make sure that there's no oil on the belly of the machine. Back up underneath the machine, there's a little recess in the casting right here, and we want to make sure that there's no oil on the belly of the machine. Sometimes back in the back, there's a little plastic plug under here, right under here in the very back part of our machine, and make sure there's no oil back here in the back of it too. I know this is just the way the Gamma machines are. These machines, if they're properly maintained and properly oiled, they will last forever. And these machines have been made like this for years and years, and there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of 25, 35-year-old machines out there still running because they were properly maintained and oiled like that. So we want to make sure that our machine is oiled. We want to make sure that the oil is cleaned up off the machine. Go ahead and oil your machine before you start if it's due for oil. We like to oil our machine every 6 to 8 hours of quilting time, 6 to 8 hours that it's actually quilting. We want to wipe down the tracks and the wheels of our machine. We use the Clorox wipes here. Wipe down the tracks, make sure that there's no gunky stuff on the wheels right here. Make sure that our encoders are clean, give them a quick wipe down. All this stuff can just take a couple of minutes, if you use your machine regularly. Remember that there's another encoder, aux encoder like this in the back of our machine, back under our cross track back there. So we'll have to clean that as well. Take a quick peek at your drive belts. If you're a computerized user, if you have a Statler and an Elevate, make sure your belts don't have gobs of thread in them. Take a peek back in here, and these pulley covers, just have a check, make sure there's not a big old knot of thread back in there. Nothing's carrying it in there right there. All right, so we want to start by putting the new needle in. we try and use a new needle for every quilt, and we want to use the 134 MR needle with the R point, the round sharp point. And 95% of the time we use the 4.0 needle, the number 4 needle. Always use a good needle. Make sure you have a good sharp needle in there before you start. We want to check our bobbin case and make sure that it's not damaged. Sometimes on our bobbin case, set this down. Sometimes on our bobbin case, if we drop them, these little arms right here can get bent. They'll get bent in a little bit and they'll drag on our bobbin. We want to make sure that our bobbin case is in good condition. They're kind of hard to straighten if they're damaged. We want to look inside and we want to make sure that our bobbin case is free of lint and that our anti-backlash spring is seated in there correctly. So this is a view. This bobbin case is the original Seiko case that comes with the machine. Here's another old one. You can see that this one, when you look at it, is really worn, or as Andrew calls it, seasoned. This is a seasoned spring, and this spring is still good, even though the bluing is wore off of it up here in the top corner and on this edge back here. It's still a good spring. It's still doing its job. So as long as it's not damaged and it's doing its job, it's still okay. We want to make sure that we don't have a bunch of lint packed down in here in between our spring and our bobbin case. Make sure your bobbin case is clean. This is the Toa bobbin case. This is a very nice bobbin case. The spring on the inside is configured completely different, but both of them work very well. I like them both. They're just two different bobbin cases, two different manufacturers, and two different springs in there. With this case, you just kind of have to make sure that you don't have a bunch of lint underneath this spring right here. So we want to make sure that our anti-backlash springs in there are seated correctly and they're doing their job. We want to check our bobbin tension, and two things about our bobbin that we want to check for. We want to make sure that our bobbin is not overwound. If it's overwound, it can drag on the inside of our bobbin case, and also we want our bobbin to feel much like the cone of thread that it comes off of. We don't want this bobbin wound so tightly that the strands get pulled into underneath the previous strands and it has to struggle to come out. We want it to feed off nice and evenly. So we want to feel this and feel what this looks like. If we press our thumbnail into the side of our wound bobbin, our freshly wound bobbin, we want it to feel much the same way as the cone of thread does. If we take our thumbnail and we press it into our cone of thread, it feels a little spongy. It's not exactly rock hard. So if we press our thumbnail into our freshly wound bobbin, we want it to feel much the same way. So after we've checked our bobbin, we want to check our bobbin tension with the Toa gauge. We want to put our bobbin in, and we always use the Toa gauge. We want you to start out, we want to have a default tension before we start. We use our Toa gauge. This bobbin is wound much too tight. You can see this one will have to be adjusted. I just pulled this bobbin case out of the box back there, so it's not been used at all. So we want to make sure that our bobbin tension is set correctly, whatever our bobbin tension needs to be. The machines are kind of individual. They have their own kind of place where they like to stitch. So whatever your bobbin tension is, there's some good videos online about how to set your bobbin tension and how to set your tension on your machine. So always check it with the toa gauge. So as for thread, we want to load your thread of choice back here. We load your thread on the back. We want to always watch our thread path. Make sure that our thread path is all clear and it's threaded correctly. Occasionally you'll get a little wrap around this post back here if you're not paying attention to it. Make sure that our thread is indeed pulled all the way down inside our intermittent tension disc, that we have it wrapped around. If you have a thread break sensor up here, have a couple of wraps around your thread break sensor. Not all machines have a thread break sensor. Make sure you have a couple wraps around it. If you're using a slicker thread like Glide or Magnifico, you may want to have like 4 or 5 wraps around there so that it grips this little sensor and the sensor doesn't spin freely like it kind of is right now. So keep an eye on that. However you thread it through your 3-hole thread guide right here. Make sure that it goes through our check spring assembly correctly. It goes around 1 3/4 of a turn around our check spring assembly. Over this guide post right here, under our 7 post right here, up, back, down, and that we have it goes through our needle. Make sure your needle is set in there correctly. We always use a needle magnet to set the angle of our needle. So we want to make sure that our needle is seated all the way up correctly and that it's in the position that we like it. I like to have just a little bit of kick on my needle to where it's not going, it's not perfectly straight in there. It's off about like 15 degrees or something, maybe not that much, 10 degrees, something like that. Just not exactly straight in the machine. So we have everything loaded up here. The machine is pretty much ready to go. We measure the quilt top. We measure the quilt top, we measure the batting, and we measure the backing because we always want to make sure, and we write it down because we want to know what we have. We want to know how big our top is. A lot of times if we know the size of our backing and we know the size of our top, we know how much area, how close to the top up here that we have to start, whether we can start down just a little bit ways or if we need to start real close up here towards the pickup leader up here. So it makes a difference. Plus it makes a difference when you're laying out your patterns. If you're a computerized user, you need to know the length of your quilt. If you're using a setup in the computerized like edge to edge or you're using repeat patterns, you need to know the size of your quilt. So take your measurements and write them down. Make sure you have enough batting and everything and that you're ready to go. So check your backing, and this is always an issue for me. We need to check our backing. There's a lot of things to look at with our backing. I wrote them down because I just kept thinking of things that we needed to look at. So does your backing fabric have a right and a wrong side? Sometimes it's hard to tell, like with batiks and some other fabrics or some solids. Sometimes it's hard to tell which side is the right side or which side is the wrong side. Maybe it doesn't make any difference, but sometimes it does. Is the backing directional? As is, does it have a pattern? Does it have birds in it that would be upside down? I actually quilted a quilt with the backing upside down. A lady ordered some fabric with a college bear cat on it, and I quilted the whole quilt out, custom quilted the whole quilt out with the backing upside down. I was embarrassed. However, when you turn the quilt down, the fabric was correct. So she was okay with it, I guess. I don't, I want to be proud of my work. I don't want to quilt the quilt upside down, quilt the backing on upside down. So that's something we have to look at. Does the quilt have a specific top or bottom? There's an artistic element that the quilt maker might have. You know, like this specifically part of the back goes to the top of the quilt or the bottom, or they see something that in the backing that I completely overlooked. So that does make a difference. Is there a label on the quilt, and where does the label go? That can make a huge difference if it needs supposed to be in the bottom left-hand corner of the quilt. There's a lot of times where I will quilt the entire quilt upside down if I can, so that I know exactly where the label needs to be. If it needs to go in the bottom right-hand corner of the quilt, I'll put it over here, so when you turn it over, it's in the bottom right-hand corner of the quilt. I think that's right. Is the seam back? Is the backing seamed? Is the backing seamed? So is it seamed? Is it pressed open? Is the seam pressed open? Or is it pressed down? That makes a difference. It makes a difference with different fabrics. It makes a difference which way the seam is. A lot of times if the seam is vertical in the backing and I think it's stitched well enough and the backing is strong enough, I like to have the seam open if the seam is vertical in my backing. If the seam is horizontal in my backing, I would prefer for the seam to be pressed down and pressed towards the belly bar. It seems to stay down if it's pressed towards the belly bar. It just seems to stay in position better. If it's pressed open, it's pressed open, and that's okay. But I'd prefer, if it's horizontal, that it be pressed down. If it's minky, however, it pretty much, like if it's a minky back and it's seamed, it needs to be pressed open because the minky is just so thick. You don't want it pressed down. You want the seam pressed open and make sure it kind of stays open. And lastly is the wrong side of the seam towards the batting. I have never done this, but I have almost done it, and our camera person here today caught me right before I started quilting the quilt with the back seamed, with the seam out towards the backing. So definitely watch for that. That would be a hard thing to fix if you quilted the quilt and then quilted over an open seam. So we try not to load the backing too tight. We seem to get better stitch quality if the back is not loaded too tight. If we don't have, this is a hand piece quilt. It has a hand piece backing too. And so we definitely don't have any tension on this back. But we want to load the back with just a small amount of tension, and we get better stitch quality. The stitches just seem to pull into the quilt, and the quilt just looks a little bit nicer if we don't have the whole quilt back and the quilt top pulled too tight. Sometimes if our quilt has no horizontal lines in it before we load the top, I got a little... If our quilt, say, has a bunch of horizontal lines in them and we don't have any point of reference in the quilt top, a lot of times about every 20 inches, I'll put a set of pins, a pin on the right and left hand side and a pin right at the center every 20 inches as we go down. And I use this as a reference to keep the quilt straight. I want to know, sometimes there's nothing to go on off of the quilt if it's strip pieced or it's applique or something like that, and you really don't have anything to go to. We can reference this just like these pins, just like if they were piecing part of the piecing that we could get on. What I definitely don't want to do is get down to the bottom and the bottom of my quilt have a big hollow place in it where the whole quilt quilted up. So I like to know where my quilt top is as I'm going down. So this is a little trick that we can use just to kind of keep our quilt top, get it set up and ready to go before we even load it. We check the top for squareness. Be sure to check for pins and buttons and sequins and thick seams and pockets and all kinds of stuff that we can find in t-shirt quilts and just other art quilts or modern quilts. You'll find all kinds of stuff on them, and there's stuff that we need to avoid, you know. So a lot of times we just want to know before we load the quilt where these pieces are, where you know, like where a pocket is, say that our hopper foot might get caught in a t-shirt quilt. And there's something we can do too. We can actually put a designer note in and pause our piecing when we get up to it. And I want to show you how we do that real quick. If, for instance, we're coming down to, say, this point right here, and we know that there's a button for our computerized users. We know there's a button or a pocket or something right here we definitely don't want to hit. We can right-click on a pink node, and in this dialog box, put pause in there. P-A-U-S-E in capital letters. And that puts a designer node right there on that node. And what the machine will do is it will come down, it will stitch to this designer node, and when it gets to that designer node, it will stop with the needle up. And that way, sometimes I'll do that if I know there's something out there, but I've got 3/4 of a row to quilt before it gets there, just so the machine will pause and wait for me, and then I can go over there and kind of hand guide it through that pocket or button or whatever's going on. That's a little trick that we can use. Let's see. We'll go back over here. Check your measurements like we talked about earlier, so that we know how far up on the top that we have to base the quilt. This one's basted pretty close to the pickup leader up here, because the back needs to be centered. The back of this quilt needs to be centered on the quilt pretty much. You can take note of the x-axis too before you start. Once you get your quilt top loaded, you can say at this corner up here is what we usually do if we're doing this. We can take note of our x-axis, where our x-axis is. Where is our x-axis? Right here. Our x-axis, we could write this number down, 111.86. And then we will know that that's where our quilt should be as we're coming back down. Because we'll put boundaries on here and delete them, and they'll go back and forth as we're going down a quilt if you're working in repeat patterns or something. But if we have that number and we have it written down, we'll know exactly where this position is, and we can always keep at least one side of our quilt straight as we're going down. And lastly, we want to check our pickup bar height. We want to keep our quilting as evenly as we can. So we want our pickup bar height back here. We want just about the thickness of the front of your finger, like this first joint in your finger right there, to be able to go underneath the pickup bar. And that seems to keep the quilt top as even as possible. So that's a lot of stuff to check before we ever take a stitch in our quilt. Once we get started, we want to check our stitching before we go too far. Maybe in the middle of our first pattern, right in here someplace, make sure that our stitching is good. We have good quality stitching. Look and feel at the back, make sure that there's It's not straight line back there, and just make sure we're good to go before we stitch too much farther, because if we have to tear it out, it'd be a lot easier to rip out just, you know, part of a pattern or correct it right there and go on. So that's about all we have for today. We really enjoy bringing you these live events. I think at the end of the month, we'll probably stop doing our daily live events. We're going to have some other educational opportunities coming up. The hand guiders will continue to be there every week on their latest thread segment. Definitely check into that every week. And I think that's about all we have for today. Do we have some questions?
Okay. After you pause the pink node and when you're ready to continue, how do you proceed?
You just press quilt. It just continue.
Or continue.
Yeah.
Who is speaking? DeWayne Carron. Any chance we could have a copy of your notes?
Absolutely. I will post this on the Gamel. I will post my no surprises notes without my misspelled notes on it on the Gamel here in a few minutes as soon as we hang out.
What is your opinion on using magic bobbin genies instead of the anti-backlash spring?
I've never used the magic bobbin genies. I know a lot of people that do. I know some competitive quilters that use them that do fabulous work with them. I don't think that there's anything wrong with them at all, as long as they're doing their job. If they do their job, I don't think it makes any difference how you control your backlash.
Which way does the spring go into the bobbin case? It can only go in one way.
It can go in 4 different ways.
Oh.
Okay, so this is the way we want our spring in our bobbin case. We want the hole down. Want to make sure that in the original spring and the Seiko spring, we want the hole down. We want this side up like this. And we want it, the cup side, we want it concave. So we want it in there.
It's
like
tilted
this.
up.
Right, so that the ears are tilted up like this. In the Seiko case, it's a little bit different. The one note to make about the Seiko case is when you put that spring in there, you can see it looks like it's in just a little bit crooked, but it is indeed actually in there correctly, like this right here. That's the way it should look.
This is the Seiko case.
Hmm?
Shout out for Dr. Pepper. I think there was one more question. I guess not.
All right, so if you have any more questions, go ahead and post them. We'll try and get them as quickly as we can. Go ahead.
How do you manage false stops at the beginning of a row?
I know what you're talking about, and it's a false thread break sensing stop. There is a video online. There's a couple ways we can do that. I'll cover real quick right here. Take and put an extra wrap or two around our thread break sensor right here. Make sure that it is indeed, it is gripping and it's not, our thread break sensor is not slipping. The second thing that we can do over here, I'm assuming she's a computerized user. He or she is a computerized user. We go to service, we go to technical support and controller definitions. Might take me a second to get our thread break sensor delay right here is set at 0.2 seconds, and we can reset that, say, up to 3. We can't do that now because we're in the middle of something. But reset that, keep clicking it up like 1 point at a time until it stops doing it. So we would like reset that from 0.2 to 0.3, go up here, file, and save and close. And that should help a lot. Some threads do that a lot. Sometimes I don't know why exactly it does that. Or you can turn your thread break sensor off and just go for it.
I want to change thread color when I get to certain areas of a quilt. How or what do I set things at?
So I would do just that. I would divide at a node. I would divide at a node, say at one of these nodes, like at this pattern. We could stop it right here. We could pause it. That's what the pause feature was originally designed for, is to change thread color. However, if you're on a great big quilt, it's hard to get all the way underneath the machine and get the bobbin thread out to change the bobbin thread if you're going to change thread color. So I would divide the pattern and stop it right here, break it, or toggle this next pattern sewn so it will stop right here, and then change our thread color, toggle this pattern unsewn, and continue stitching if that's what you, if you're going to change thread color right there.
I think that's all.
All right, guys. Well, this has been a lot of fun, and we'll probably wind up catching you one more time before the end of the month. And if not, we've really enjoyed bringing this to you, and we'll see you next time. So have a good day. Bye-bye.